She wasn't speeding, she wasn't swerving, she wasn't doing anything wrong. But in a world built on appearances, sometimes being composed, black and female behind the wheel is enough to become a suspect. The streets of Greenville, North Carolina, were asleep beneath the watchful eye of a low-hanging moon. It was the kind of night where porch lights flickered like lazy fireflies, and the hum of distant crickets softened the air like a lullaby. Street by street, the world exhaled. Most of the city had curled into beds, dreams just beginning to bloom behind closed eyes. But Colonel Naomi Bryant wasn't asleep. She was still driving. Her hands gripped the wheel with quiet familiarity, her posture upright but relaxed. She wore a plain black blouse, sleeves rolled neatly above her elbows, and a silver chain bracelet her father had given her after her second deployment. The black government-issued SUV she navigated wasn't flashy, just clean, functional, and low profile. No decals, no extra chrome, tinted windows, yes, but nothing outside of regulation. Naomi didn't need flash. She was power without noise, rank without ego. After 2 decades in uniform, leading military logistics across continents and disasters, she'd learned that the loudest voices were rarely the strongest. And tonight, she was just trying to get home after a long day at Fort Braddock, where a strategic operations meeting had run long, as they often did. She should have been home 2 hours ago. She should have been greeted by the soft flicker of her kitchen light and the scent of lemon balm from the diffuser she always left on. But now, she was on Highway 17, one hand on the wheel, the other drumming softly to the rhythm of tires on pavement, her mind already half an hour ahead, picturing her dog stretched across the couch and the stack of reports waiting on her desk. She didn't know it yet, but someone was watching her. Just off the highway, in the shadowed curve beneath a flickering street lamp, sat a Greenville PD cruiser, silent, still, and almost invisible to passing eyes. Inside, Officer Brent Keller sipped stale gas station coffee from a dented thermos and scrolled lazily through his phone, only half interested in the traffic around him. His shift had been uneventful. No fights, no drunks, no action, just hours of stillness and static, interrupted only by dispatch chatter and the occasional groan of tires on asphalt. And then, he saw it. A black SUV, unfamiliar plates, tinted windows, out-of-county registration. Late at night, no one else on the road. He put his thermos down. To Brent Keller, it didn't matter that the SUV wasn't doing anything wrong. What mattered was that it was out of place, unfamiliar, slightly too confident. And confidence to Keller was a red flag. Without hesitation, he clicked on the siren lights. Red and blue blinked across the empty road like an accusation. The SUV slowed without panic, then pulled to the shoulder in one smooth motion. Inside the SUV, Naomi blinked once. She saw the flashing lights, she checked her mirrors, and then she exhaled slowly. Not because she was afraid, but because she was familiar. This wasn't new. She'd spent 20 years training soldiers how to move with discipline under pressure, how to remain calm in conflict, how to survive systems that weren't always built with their safety in mind. And tonight, she would take her own advice. She rolled the window halfway down, kept her hands visible on the wheel, and waited. The cruiser door slammed behind her. Heavy boots approached. The beam of a flashlight cut across her rearview mirror. Then he appeared. Officer Brent Keller. Tall, square-jawed, hand resting casually but deliberately on his holstered firearm. His other hand held the flashlight, which he angled directly into her face, not to illuminate, but to control. "License and registration," he said without greeting. Naomi's voice was measured. "Officer, may I ask why I've been stopped?" "You were drifting between lanes," he replied, voice flat, "didn't signal. Looked like you might be under the influence." She raised an eyebrow, the first flicker of emotion crossing her otherwise composed face. "I wasn't." "License and registration," he repeated, louder this time. Naomi moved slowly, no sudden motions. Every movement deliberate, professional. She reached into the glove compartment and handed over the documents. As she did, she added, "This is a federal government vehicle. I'm a U.S. Army officer returning from a logistics briefing." Keller squinted at the ID. His smirk was almost imperceptible, but it was there. "You military?" "Yes, sir." "Colonel Naomi Bryant." "Don't matter," he said. "That don't put you above the law." "I never said it did." The pause between them thickened. Keller leaned slightly closer. "Step out of the vehicle." Naomi blinked. "Excuse me?" I said, he repeated, step out of the vehicle. I'm conducting a sobriety test. Her jaw tightened. On what grounds? You're refusing a lawful order now? No, she said firmly. I'm asking for clarification. That was when Keller reached for the door handle himself. Her breath didn't quicken. Her eyes didn't dart. Instead, she tapped the record button on her phone and angled the screen toward his chest. Just so we're clear, she said calmly. This interaction is now being recorded. For the first time, a sliver of hesitation crossed Keller's face. Not fear, just calculation. But it was fleeting. Out of the car, he ordered again. Naomi stepped out, not reluctantly, not dramatically, but with presence. Her posture straightened, her hands relaxed at her sides. Even in civilian clothing, she carried the discipline of command. There was nothing arrogant in her demeanor, only precision, clarity, stillness. Keller made her walk a line, follow a finger, recite the alphabet backward. She passed each with quiet excellence. Still, he handed her a citation. Failure to maintain lane. Naomi took it. Not a word, not a raised voice, just a look. Then she got back into her vehicle, placed the citation neatly in her console, and drove away. But Keller had made a mistake. He thought the stop was over. He thought this was another faceless motorist. He thought his badge was enough to end the story. He didn't know that the woman he had just humiliated in the dark wasn't just someone with a title. She was a storm wrapped in silk. She was a soldier with discipline carved into her bones, and she was tired of letting things go. Because some people raise their voice when they've been wronged. Others raise their standard. And Colonel Naomi Bryant had just begun to write a new kind of report, one that wouldn't fit in a glove box, but would change the system from the inside out. Officer Brent Keller liked silence. Not the kind of silence that came from peace, but the kind that settled in a room when he walked into it. The silence of authority, of unease. He liked when rookie officers sat up straighter around him, when civilians shifted uncomfortably under his gaze. He liked control, not as a principle, but as a habit. He was a product of 17 years in the force. And in those years, Keller had built himself a reputation, dependable on paper, precise with policy. But if you asked those who worked around him, really asked them, they'd describe him another way. Tense, aggressive, quick to escalate, always ready to turn a request into a command and a question into defiance. But Keller didn't care. He did his job. He made his stops. He filled out his reports. And more importantly, he was rarely questioned. His supervisors liked him because he didn't cause them problems. The union backed him because he knew how to frame things just right. The city had never paid a settlement under his name, and the body cam footage, when it was reviewed, usually stopped just short of concern. That's why, after his stop with Colonel Naomi Bryant, he barely gave it a second thought. Back at the Greenville PD substation, Keller dropped the citation into the system with the casual indifference of someone ordering lunch. Failure to maintain lane. Possible signs of impairment. No arrest. No resistance. No further action required. He unplugged his body cam, docked it on the charging port, and walked away. Later that night, while sipping microwave coffee in the break room, he recounted the stop like a funny anecdote. Some woman in a government SUV tries to pull rank on me, he said, leaning back in his chair, boots crossed. Flashes a badge or something, thought she was above the law. Another officer, Corporal Lena West, raised an eyebrow from across the room. What was her name? Keller shrugged. Bryant. Naomi Bryant. Colonel, apparently. West set her mug down. You mean Colonel Naomi Bryant, Logistics Command at Fort Braddock? Keller chuckled, amused at her reaction. Yeah, that's what she claimed. Gave me that look like I was supposed to back off. But West didn't laugh. She leaned forward, her expression sharpening. Brent, Colonel Bryant briefed the FEMA Joint Ops Unit last quarter. She's one of the highest-ranking reserve officers in the Southeast. She's not some admin desk jockey. She's serious brass. Keller's amusement faded, but only slightly. So? What's that supposed to mean? It means you might have just poked a bear you weren't ready for, she said quietly. And if she recorded it, and you were even slightly out of line, that's not just bad optics, that's a career ender. He scoffed. I followed protocol. She passed the test. I let her go. End of story. But West didn't say anything else. She just got up and walked out, leaving Keller alone in a suddenly colder break room. But it wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning. Because Naomi Bryant hadn't just driven away that night. She'd gone home, sat down at her desk, opened her laptop, and started writing. Not in anger, not with fire, but with the calm, methodical intensity of a woman who had spent years writing briefings that moved troops and shifted policy. First, she uploaded the footage from her phone. Then she clipped it, time-stamped it, added notes. She attached a formal statement and filed it with Internal Affairs, then with Greenville PD's Civil Oversight Committee, then the Office of the Inspector General. By morning, the incident had moved through 4 federal inboxes. By afternoon, it had been flagged by Military Legal Counsel. And by evening, a digital file marked Urgent JAG was being reviewed by 2 officers in Fort Braddock's legal division. But Keller? He was back on patrol, stopping drivers, writing citations, believing the world still worked the way it always had for him. He didn't know that the badge on his chest had just become a spotlight. That the camera he had docked was no longer just another piece of equipment, but evidence. He didn't know that his casual swagger was about to be weighed in a courtroom, not by the city, but by the woman he'd underestimated. Because Naomi wasn't angry. She was resolved. She had spent her career watching young soldiers get spoken over. She had trained women who were dismissed before they ever opened their mouths. She had mentored civilians who told her the same stories over and over again. About traffic stops that turned into threats, about officers who made assumptions and got away with it. And she had always told them to stand tall, to speak truth, to demand respect, not as a reaction, but as a right. Now it was her turn. She wasn't going to raise her voice. She was going to raise the bar. The house was dark when Colonel Naomi Bryant walked in. She didn't turn on the lights right away. She stood at the door for a moment, listening to the silence, to her own breath, to the low thrum of something deep in her chest that wasn't quite anger, but wasn't peace either. She placed the citation on the entry table like it was contaminated. The dog, her aging golden retriever Samson, lifted his head from the couch and blinked at her, too old to bark, but loyal enough to notice when something wasn't right. Naomi sat beside him and ran a hand gently down his back. "I'm okay," she whispered. But even she didn't fully believe it. She'd been through worse. She'd faced down corruption in logistics contracts overseas, navigated diplomatic chaos in hurricane zones, and managed convoys through dangerous terrain. She had been under fire, both literal and political. But tonight, back on American soil, behind the wheel of her own vehicle, wearing no insignia but her skin, she'd been stripped of everything but her calm. That calm had kept her alive. That calm was her armor. But tonight, she was tired of it being her only shield. At exactly 2:13 a.m., Naomi opened her laptop. She didn't rant on social media. She didn't post a video for views or outrage. She wrote a report, a field-grade officer's report. Precise, chronological, clean. She embedded timestamps from the phone footage, detailing every moment. The moment the lights appeared. The moment the flashlight hit her face. The verbal exchanges. The unnecessary sobriety test. The smirk. The tone. The silence when she said her rank. Then, she attached the footage to a formal civilian rights violation complaint filed with Greenville Police Department's Office of Professional Standards. It didn't stop there. She copied Internal Affairs, then Army JAG, and finally submitted a notice to the Office of the Inspector General, not just for her own protection but for systemic review. She didn't write a single accusatory sentence, just the truth. The raw, undeniable, time-stamped truth. Her final line in the complaint was simple. This is not about power. This is about protection, from assumptions, from escalation, from the silence that so often follows these stops. Then she hit send. The next morning, Lieutenant Commander Justin Cho, legal counsel at Fort Braddock, found her email in his inbox before sunrise. By 7:15, the footage was being screened on a secure base terminal. By 9, it had been shared with a senior compliance officer at the Office of Military Civil Rights. None of them saw an angry woman. They saw a soldier executing a tactical operation of accountability with every detail documented and every movement precise. And by noon, a quiet inquiry had begun. Meanwhile, Officer Brent Keller was on patrol, completely unaware that he'd become a case number in a federal database. He joked in the locker room about a woman with too much attitude, still thinking this was a one-day inconvenience. He even reenacted the sobriety test with exaggerated motions for laughs. The room chuckled. Lightly. Uncomfortably. But it wasn't just Naomi's rank that was starting to shift the air. It was the way she'd moved, with grace, with poise, with control, that couldn't be dismissed. Officers who had seen a still from the footage started asking quiet questions. Did you see her body language? She didn't resist. She didn't escalate. Why'd he push that hard? Even some of Keller's allies stopped laughing when the words Colonel Bryant started circulating through official emails. Still, Keller waved it off. She thinks her medals mean she can dodge a traffic citation. This'll blow over. But this wasn't about a citation. This was about how quickly someone with a badge could twist the rules, and how rarely anyone questioned it. Back at her home office, Naomi was already 3 steps ahead. She met with Major Delaney Price, a civilian lawyer who had worked pro bono on behalf of veterans and federal employees. Price wasn't flashy. She didn't take media cases. She took justice cases. They met in private, no press, no theatrics. She violated your Fourth Amendment rights, Delaney said after reviewing the footage. Unlawful detainment, no probable cause, intimidation, disregard for federal ID, and he touched your door. Naomi nodded. I don't want media. I don't want a headline. I want precedent. Delaney leaned back. You'll get it, but it won't be pretty. I'm not here for pretty, Naomi replied. I'm here for clarity. They began building the case, quietly but powerfully, gathering federal vehicle records, dash cam logs, cross-checking times, location data, body cam footage from the precinct, submitting FOIA requests. No noise, just pressure. Then came the letter. 3 days later, an envelope was delivered to Greenville PD, addressed to Officer Brent Keller. Inside, a formal notice of civil inquiry, a lawsuit filed in Pitt County Civil Court, backed by federal complaint references. Plaintiff, Colonel Naomi Bryant charges violation of constitutional rights, abuse of authority, unlawful detainment. For the first time since the stop, Keller's confidence cracked. He stared at the envelope in disbelief. Across the bullpen, his captain stepped out of the office. Keller, inside. Now. This was no longer about a misunderstanding. This was about a system that had been unchecked for too long. And the woman who had calmly decided not to burn it down, but to illuminate it, piece by piece. Because Naomi Bryant hadn't raised her voice, she had raised the standard. The captain's office was uncomfortably still. The blinds were half closed, filtering pale daylight through narrow slats, casting striped shadows across the desk. The room smelled of old coffee and newer consequences. Officer Brent Keller stood across from Captain Marla Jennings, arms folded, jaw tight. He hadn't sat down. He didn't like the look in her eyes. It wasn't fury. Keller could handle fury. No, this was something worse. It was disappointment wrapped in restraint. Jennings held the envelope in her hand without opening it, but the look on her face told him she already knew what was inside. She's suing? He said finally, the words flat, but the undertone tight. She's not just suing, Jennings replied, calm but cutting. She filed a formal civil rights complaint, cited 4 federal statutes. She has video footage, both her own and your body cam, already reviewed by her legal counsel and now by the Inspector General's office. She was smug, Keller snapped, flashed her ID like it meant she didn't have to follow protocol. Jennings didn't flinch. According to her report, she followed every protocol. You didn't. And more than that, you escalated without cause. He felt the flush rise in his neck. You taking her side? I'm taking the side of the evidence. That sentence hit harder than he expected. In the hallway outside, the shift was already beginning. Word had gotten out. Not just the fact that Colonel Naomi Bryant was suing, but how she'd done it. With meticulous timing, unshakable professionalism, and a type of legal grace that didn't leave room for theatrics or assumptions. It spread through the department like heat rising through floorboards. She got him on body cam. She didn't even raise her voice. She's the one that trained logistics officers at Braddock last year. Did you see how calm she was? Keller felt it all. The stares, the half-conversations that stopped when he walked in. He wasn't used to being the one under review. He was used to being the reviewer. Now he was the subject of hushed sentences and legal memos. He told himself it didn't matter. But it did. Because this wasn't about a bad day or a single mistake. This was about a system used to silencing accountability. And the one woman who refused to play her assigned part. Back at her home office, Naomi Bryant was methodically reviewing notes with Delaney Price, her lawyer. They sat in silence for a moment after watching the footage for the third time. Delaney finally spoke. "You sure you're ready to see this through? Once this goes to court, your name's going to be in every internal PD newsletter. They'll dig. They'll twist." Naomi didn't blink. "They can dig. There's nothing to find. It might get ugly. It already got ugly. I just turned the lights on." Delaney gave a short nod. "You're not looking for a settlement, are you?" Naomi looked at her squarely. "I'm looking for a record. Something that says this happened. Something a younger soldier can point to if it happens to them." Meanwhile, the Greenville PD legal advisor had begun consulting outside counsel. The city wasn't just worried about the lawsuit. They were worried about what the optics would become. A black female colonel with an unblemished service record. A white officer with a pattern of aggressive stops, some dismissed quietly in the past. And now, video evidence that was impossible to ignore. A city attorney, after previewing the video, summed it up in one sentence. "This is what happens when a system that protects bad habits finally hits someone with more power, more composure, and more proof." Inside his apartment, Keller watched the video clip for the first time on his department-issued laptop. He didn't recognize the woman in the footage, not at first. She wasn't flinching. She wasn't uncertain. She was composed, graceful, precise. He watched himself bark orders, watched his flashlight hit her face, watched his hand hover near his holster. She never raised her voice, never stepped out of line, but somehow it was clear he was the one out of control. His stomach turned, not because he felt guilty, but because he knew for the first time he had been caught. 3 days later, Naomi's case was officially listed on the Pitt County Civil Court docket. The name Bryant vs. Keller was published in internal police bulletins. Emails were sent to officers involved in previous stops with Keller. Review boards began reopening closed complaints. Union reps started drafting contingency statements. This wasn't just Naomi's moment. It was a spotlight she'd triggered across the entire department. A detective said quietly in the hallway, "If she hadn't recorded it, it would have just been her word." A younger officer replied, "If she hadn't been a colonel, no one would have believed it anyway." And that was the point. Naomi returned to her duties at Fort Braddock without skipping a beat. She didn't broadcast the lawsuit. She didn't gloat. She kept showing up, kept commanding her team, kept building training programs for junior officers, and managing disaster relief inventory audits. But behind the scenes, she continued to prepare. Not for war, for truth. Because there was something bigger at stake than one interaction. There was a culture that needed to be exposed, not through outrage, but through evidence, ethics, and unshakable calm. The courthouse didn't look like much from the outside. Just another stone building with fading brickwork and a clock that hadn't kept the right time in years. But that morning, as the double glass doors of Pitt County Civil Court opened to the public, the air shifted. Not because there were reporters, not because of flashing cameras, but because of who walked in. Colonel Naomi Bryant stepped into the courthouse lobby with her back straight, her footsteps even, and her uniform impeccable. Her service blues were crisp, adorned with polished metals that caught the morning light in brief glints. The silver eagle insignia on her shoulders gleamed like silent guards, and the subtle sway of her ribbons told stories she didn't need to speak. The security officer at the metal detector stood a little taller. The clerk behind the front desk stopped typing. A few civilians in line for traffic court leaned in and whispered. She didn't nod, didn't smirk. She walked with purpose, not for drama, but for truth. This wasn't performance. This was declaration. Inside the courtroom, Brent Keller was already seated at the defense table, wearing a charcoal gray suit that felt tighter than it had last week. His tie was crooked, his knuckles were white against the table edge. He turned as the doors opened and saw her. For the first time since that night on the roadside, the smugness drained from his face. The woman he had pulled over, treated like a suspect, talked down to, questioned with his hand hovering over his weapon. She wasn't some smug driver now. She was a commanding officer walking into federal proceedings with full authority and undeniable presence. And this time, he was the one in her jurisdiction. The gallery wasn't filled with reporters or camera crews. It was filled with people who cared. Off-duty officers from Fort Braddock sat in the back row, their uniforms muted but respectful. A few civilians, law students, veterans, young cadets had come just to watch. Word had spread quietly across the region. This wasn't just another civil suit. This was a reckoning. Naomi took her seat next to Delaney Price, who wore a navy blue blazer and carried a stack of neatly organized files. She leaned in slightly and whispered, "You ready?" Naomi's answer was simple, "I've been ready." At the bench, Judge Celeste Hargrove entered and took her seat. Silver-haired, stern, and unshakably impartial, she scanned the courtroom before speaking. In the matter of Bryant v. Keller, Civil Complaint 23401C, we begin with opening statements. Delaney stood first. Her voice was steady, her tone clear. "Your Honor, we intend to prove that my client, Colonel Naomi Bryant, was subjected to unlawful detainment, intimidation, and abuse of authority by Officer Brent Keller during a traffic stop with no probable cause. My client complied with every instruction. She remained calm, respectful, and transparent. The officer, however, escalated the interaction without justification, and in doing so, violated her civil rights under the Fourth Amendment of the United States Constitution." She turned slightly to the jury. "This is not a case about traffic infractions. This is a case about how power is wielded and what happens when it goes unchecked." Keller's attorney, Mark Sutton, offered a careful, sanitized rebuttal. Officer Keller followed departmental protocol. He initiated a routine stop and responded to what he perceived as potential impairment. He had no knowledge of Colonel Bryant's rank at the time, and his actions were intended to ensure public safety. If any errors occurred, they were not malicious but procedural. But words only go so far. When the video evidence was introduced, the air in the room thickened. First, Naomi's phone footage, clear, steady, irrefutable. The way Keller spoke to her, the flashlight directly into her eyes, the tone, the command, the control, and her quiet dignity in return. Then came the body cam footage. It showed more than just dialogue. It showed posture, tension, the aggression in Keller's movements, the patronizing smirk when she said "Colonel," the dismissiveness when she passed the sobriety test flawlessly. The jury didn't gasp. They didn't need to. The room had already made its shift. When Naomi took the stand, she didn't bring fire. She brought clarity. Delaney asked, "Colonel Bryant, can you walk us through the events of the night in question?" Naomi's voice was even. "I was driving home from Fort Braddock after a planning session regarding hurricane relief logistics. I was not speeding. I was not swerving. I was stopped without explanation, subjected to field testing, and given a citation without cause. Did you ever raise your voice? No. Did you comply with all orders? Yes. Did you identify yourself as a federal officer? I did. Twice." Delaney paused. "So why do you believe you were treated the way you were?" The heck, Naomi looked at the jury. Her gaze wasn't sharp, it was thoughtful. "Because I didn't look like what he expected power to look like." Then came cross-examination. Sutton tried to press, tried to paint the stop as standard. "Colonel, do you believe that officers should not be allowed to act on suspicion?" "I believe suspicion must be rooted in evidence, not assumption." Couldn't Officer Keller have simply been concerned? Naomi's voice was calm but unyielding. Concern doesn't begin with a flashlight in the eyes and a hand on a weapon. That's not concern. That's control. Sutton's face flushed slightly. He stepped back. Finally, Keller was asked to view the footage again, frame by frame, his hand on the door. Her soft, "Excuse me," when he demanded she exit. The moment she turned on her camera. The moment he flinched, just slightly. The prosecutor asked, "Officer Keller, were you aware she was a colonel at the time?" "No. And if you had known?" Keller hesitated. "I probably would have handled it differently." That answer echoed, not with shock, with understanding, because it confirmed what the whole room already knew. He didn't see her as a person, he saw her as a problem. Until she wore something he respected. And now, in front of the court, he was the one being judged. The courtroom had gone quiet. Not just the kind of quiet where people stop talking, but the kind that settles deep into the walls. The kind of silence that made you forget to breathe. That made chairs creak louder, and even the hum of the old ceiling fan sound like thunder. Colonel Naomi Bryant sat calmly at the witness stand, the weight of her uniform pressing into the wooden seat beneath her. But she didn't flinch. Her shoulders remained back, her chin never lowered. She had testified. She had told the truth. And now, the truth lived outside her. She no longer carried it alone. Across the room, Officer Brent Keller sat stiffly at the defense table, his attorney whispering behind folded notes. But Keller's mind was elsewhere. Stuck. He had watched the footage. He had heard the tone in his own voice, how clipped, how dismissive, how certain. He had seen himself looking down at a woman who never once raised her voice, never once challenged his authority, because she never needed to. That was what made it worse. She hadn't resisted, she hadn't yelled. And still he had treated her like a problem, and now, sitting across from her, he saw what he'd really pulled over that night. Not just a colonel. Not just a soldier. But a mirror. And the reflection was ugly. The jury had watched both versions of the same night. One, through Keller's camera, shaky, forceful, rushed. The other, through Naomi's lens, smooth, controlled, sobering. It wasn't just about what was said. It was about what was felt. The way she stayed still when he tried to provoke. The way she breathed through every insult. The way she spoke her rank not to brag, but to remind him, and herself, that her dignity was not his to diminish. The prosecutor stood and asked one final question. Colonel Bryant, why did you file this lawsuit? Naomi didn't look at the jury. She didn't look at Keller. She looked forward, toward something no one else in the room could see, but everyone could feel. I filed this because I've seen too many people, especially women, especially black women, get stopped, dismissed, humiliated, and then told to be grateful they weren't hurt. I've seen young soldiers swallow disrespect to keep their records clean. I've seen civilians smile through fear just to avoid escalation. Her voice didn't rise, it deepened. I didn't file this for a payout. I filed this for a record. Something permanent. Something future recruits can point to and say, this is what happened, and this is why we don't let it happen again. She paused, and then one more sentence. Power isn't proven by how loud you speak. It's proven by how steady you stand. The judge nodded. Thank you, Colonel Bryant. She stepped down, and the room exhaled. The defense made a last-ditch appeal. Keller's attorney tried to humanize him. Officer Keller has served for 17 years. No prior lawsuits, no official misconduct. This case, if anything, is a misunderstanding of intent. But the words fell flat, not because they weren't technically true, but because the courtroom had already seen the truth. And it was captured frame by frame. For the next 2 hours, the jury sat behind closed doors. 12 strangers, now tasked with deciding whether Keller's actions were merely poor judgment, or something deeper, more dangerous. A symptom of a culture that had, for too long, rewarded control over character. Naomi sat quietly in the hallway. She didn't pace. Her lawyer offered to chat, but she declined. She pulled a small notebook from her bag and jotted down a few thoughts. Not about the verdict, about the next training module she was building for Fort Braddock. She hadn't forgotten her mission. Whatever happened today, she would still be a leader tomorrow. When the jury returned, the room held its breath again. Judge Hargrove shuffled the papers, then cleared her throat. In the matter of Bryant v. Keller, the jury finds in favor of the plaintiff. No reaction from Naomi. No visible change in her posture. The judge continued, "We recognize a violation of constitutional rights during an unlawful stop and detainment, as well as conduct unbecoming of an officer entrusted with public safety. The court awards damages of $40,000, and this decision will be permanently recorded in both department and federal records." She paused, then added, "This ruling will also be forwarded to the Department of Justice and the Greenville Police Department for internal policy evaluation." Keller's attorney leaned in and whispered, "We'll appeal." But even he didn't sound convinced. Naomi stood and nodded, not to the judge, not to the jury, to herself. She had done what she came to do. Outside, a few local reporters were waiting now. Just a handful. Keller slipped past them quickly, head down, shielding his face with a folder. He didn't speak, he didn't smile, he didn't feel untouchable anymore. Inside, Naomi walked down the corridor, phone in hand. A notification had popped up, "Verdict in your favor, case closed." Her lawyer caught up to her. "You could have asked for more." Naomi shook her head. "It was never about the money." Delaney looked at her. "You think it'll change anything?" Naomi paused at the exit, sunlight warming the steel buttons on her jacket. "I don't know," she said. "But maybe next time he pulls someone over, he'll think twice." The courtroom had been cleared. The judge's gavel had long been silenced. The echoes of testimony had faded from the wood-paneled walls. But outside those walls, the real verdict was just beginning to unfold. Officer Brent Keller sat alone at his desk inside the Greenville Police Department's precinct. His nameplate sat askew, his inbox pinged with unread emails. The chatter of the bullpen buzzed around him, but none of it included him. Not anymore. A folder sat open in front of him, stamped with the department's seal and labeled Administrative Leave, Internal Affairs Review Pending. Inside, 2 pages outlined what he already knew. He was being pulled from active duty. His prior stops were being audited. A departmental review board would convene within 30 days. No badge, no patrol, just a desk. And a silence he couldn't control. Across town, at Fort Braddock, the atmosphere was markedly different. Colonel Naomi Bryant returned to her post not with fanfare, but with focus. She walked through the command wing like she always had. Calm, poised, never rushed. Her subordinates greeted her the way they always did, with a mix of respect and quiet admiration. But this time, there was something else in the air. Reverence. Because news of the verdict had made its rounds. Not through headlines, not through social media, but through the chain of command, through whispered conversations in training rooms and late-night barracks talks. They knew what she'd done. Not just that she'd filed a complaint, not just that she'd won, but that she had done it without raising her voice, without slinging blame, without breaking character. She had modeled something deeper than discipline. She had shown what principled power looked like. In the days that followed, subtle shifts occurred within both institutions. At Greenville PD, a memo was issued requiring new de-escalation training for all officers. The city attorney's office flagged a handful of past complaints involving Keller, cases previously closed without follow-up. Now they were under review. In Keller's precinct, conversations grew shorter when he walked by. Respect was no longer assumed. Because authority, it turned out, could be examined, and once examined, it could be questioned. Back at Fort Braddock, Naomi spent her mornings running briefings and her evenings working on a new training initiative, Leadership Under Pressure. Integrity in unseen moments. It wasn't a class about lawsuits, it wasn't about protest or defiance. It was about character. The kind forged not in spotlights but in small decisions. She wrote modules on conflict navigation, communication during civilian interaction, and ethical escalation. She used her own experience, not to center herself, but to demonstrate the responsibility of the uniform. Rank is not armor, she wrote in one of the slides. It is a mirror. And the question is, when others look at you, what do they see reflected back? Meanwhile, Keller was quietly transferred out of field duty. Rumors swirled. Some said he'd be reassigned to administrative processing. Others said the department was pressuring him to resign before the DOJ recommendation arrived. None of it surprised him anymore. Because the part that haunted him most wasn't the verdict. It wasn't even the footage. It was the stillness on Naomi's face when she stood in court. The way she didn't fight him. The way she didn't need to. She had simply allowed the truth to speak. And it had spoken louder than any siren ever could. 3 weeks after the verdict, Naomi sat with a group of senior officers during a leadership roundtable. One of them, a new captain recently transferred from another state, asked her, "How did you manage to stay so composed during all of it?" Naomi looked at him for a moment, then answered, "Because composure is what power looks like when it knows it doesn't have to prove anything." There was a pause around the table, and then a quiet nod from nearly everyone seated. Later that evening, Naomi returned to her office. The sunset filtered through the high windows, painting the walls in amber. She pulled out a letter, a handwritten note that had arrived that morning. It was from a young black woman stationed in Texas, a junior logistics officer. She had seen the court summary online, passed around internally through officer forums. The letter read, "Colonel Bryant, I don't know you personally, but I know what it feels like to be invisible behind a uniform that's supposed to protect you. What you did, what you stood for, means more than you'll ever know. You didn't just fight back, you showed us how to fight forward." Naomi closed the letter and placed it gently in her desk drawer. Not as a trophy, as a reminder. The fight wasn't over, but it was no longer silent. The room was filled with fresh faces, some barely out of high school, others a bit older. Recruits in freshly issued fatigues, their boots still unscuffed, their collars still stiff. They sat in rows inside the Fort Braddock Leadership Hall, shifting nervously in their seats, eyes wide, pens clutched tightly like they were waiting for a test they didn't know how to study for. Today wasn't a logistics briefing. It wasn't about weapons protocol or tactical formation. Today was different. Colonel Naomi Bryant stood at the front of the room, not behind a podium, not holding a binder, just present, hands lightly clasped, her uniform quiet but commanding. No music, no video introduction, no applause, only her. And that was more than enough. "I want to ask you a question," she said, voice clear but soft. "How many of you believe that wearing this uniform earns you automatic respect?" A few hands went up, hesitantly, one or two confidently, most wavered in midair. Naomi nodded slowly. "I understand why you'd think that. You've been told this uniform stands for something. You've been taught that your rank will carry weight, that the patch on your shoulder means something in every room you walk into." She paused. "But I'm here to tell you something else. Respect isn't something you wear. It's something you prove. Every day. In every moment, especially when no one is watching. Silence. Not disinterest but attention. The kind of attention that comes when someone isn't just giving a speech, they're telling the truth." She paced slowly across the room, not for effect but for connection. Her eyes met theirs, one row at a time. "When I was pulled over on the side of a quiet road, I wasn't in uniform. I wasn't in formation. I was just a woman, in a car, at night." The room grew stiller. The officer didn't know my rank, didn't ask my name. He saw tinted windows and skin like mine and assumed I was a problem. A long pause. I could have panicked. I could have yelled. I could have stayed silent and let it go, but I didn't. I recorded. I reported. I stood still, and I told the truth. One of the recruits in the back sat a little straighter. Naomi turned toward them, stopping in the center of the room. Because power that isn't accountable is just arrogance in a costume, and silence, especially in uniform, is not discipline, it's compliance. She let those words breathe, then continued. "You're going to be tested, not just in combat or training, but in integrity. You'll see things you shouldn't, you'll hear things that don't sit right, and you'll have to choose. Go along to keep peace, or stand up to keep principle." Another pause. She let the weight settle. "I didn't bring charges against that officer because I needed revenge. I brought them because I needed a record. Something solid. Something that says this happened, and we didn't stay silent about it." Naomi walked slowly back to the front, standing still once more. Leadership isn't about command. It's about consistency. It's about who you are when no one knows your name or your rank. When you don't have backup, when someone's hand is on their weapon and their eyes say they've already judged you. Her voice softened, but became even stronger. And in that moment, you don't fight fire with fire. You fight it with clarity, with calm, with character. Some of the recruits nodded now, others were still, but none of them were looking away. Naomi exhaled, then delivered the final words like a quiet drum beat. "The badge, the rank, the title, they're not shields. They're not weapons. They're responsibilities. And if you can't carry them with dignity, then you don't deserve to carry them at all." She stepped back. No applause, no clapping, just silence. But it wasn't the silence of hesitation anymore. It was the silence of understanding, of realization, of seeds being planted that would one day grow into decisions made under pressure. She nodded once, then walked out of the room, not for praise, but because the work was already done. The days that followed the verdict were not filled with cameras or ceremonies. There were no headlines splashed across national media, no news vans camped outside Naomi's door, no interviews, no trending hashtags, and Naomi preferred it that way. Because this wasn't a moment meant to go viral. It was a moment meant to last. At Fort Braddock, the rhythm of command had resumed. Morning meetings, logistics reports, emergency readiness briefings. Naomi moved through them all as she always had, measured, efficient, unshakably composed. But there were moments, brief ones, when the stillness returned. The kind that crept in when her office door clicked shut behind her at the end of the day, when the hallway lights dimmed and the rest of the world had gone quiet. That's when the memory returned, not of the stop itself, not of the courtroom, but of what it all meant. She sat one night in her office, the room softly lit by the amber desk lamp beside her. The verdict notification still sat in her inbox, unread. Not because she hadn't seen it, but because she didn't need to read it again. The real confirmation didn't live in that message. It lived in the small shifts she now noticed. The young soldier who stood a little taller when saluting her. The junior officer who whispered thank you in the hallway, then kept walking. The fellow female colonel who emailed her a single sentence, "You made us visible." It lived in the silence after her speech. In the slow ripple of accountability that moved through her base like an unseen current. In the weight lifted from the shoulders of people she might never meet. But there was a cost. There always is. Her inbox had also collected messages she didn't respond to. Anonymous notes warning her to stay in her lane. Online threads suggesting she had played the race card. One message that simply read, "No one likes a soldier who turns on the system." She didn't flinch, but she wasn't numb either. She had served long enough to know. When you stand quietly but firmly, it shakes those who rely on noise and dominance to stay standing. One afternoon, weeks after the verdict, Naomi stood at a coffee station in the officer commons when she heard a familiar voice behind her. Captain Marla Jennings, Greenville PD, on base for a joint emergency coordination session. Naomi turned slowly, her cup halfway to her lips. Jennings gave a nod, not forced, not apologetic, just human. "I don't know if it means anything now," she said, "but I'm sorry for how long it took to recognize what was obvious." Naomi didn't rush to respond. She studied Jennings for a moment, then said, "The truth isn't always obvious to people who've never had to prove they deserve to be heard." Jennings nodded once more. "I'm working on it." Naomi tilted her head slightly. "That's the only thing that matters." They didn't shake hands. They didn't pose for a picture. They just let the moment be what it was. That night, Naomi took a walk by herself through the outer perimeter trail that circled the base. The sun had dipped low behind the hills. The trees cast long shadows. The gravel crunched under her boots like quiet applause. She thought of her father, a man who had once served in Vietnam, then returned home to a country that didn't thank him. He used to say, "Sometimes you win, not by shouting, but by staying." And that's what Naomi had done. She had stayed calm, stayed present, stayed standing when everything in the system expected her to shrink. As she reached the clearing where the old flagpole stood, Naomi paused. She looked up at the flag fluttering softly in the evening wind. She didn't salute, she just breathed. Because this fight, this quiet, exhausting, deliberate stand wasn't about a flag or a title. It was about everyone who had ever been pulled over, talked down to, and told they imagined it. It was about every person who had been questioned not for what they did, but for who they were. And it was about what happens when just one person decides not to let it go. 2 months later, the sun rose over Fort Braddock like it always did. Soft, golden, undramatic. But inside the base's East Wing training auditorium, something different was happening. The room was packed, not with brass or dignitaries, with beginners, fresh recruits. Their fatigues still stiff, their notebooks still empty, their boots barely broken in. They'd been told a senior officer was coming to speak. What they hadn't been told was that they were about to witness something they'd remember long after their first deployment, their first mission, their first mistake. Colonel Naomi Bryant stood at the front of the room, not in her service blues this time, but in fatigues just like theirs. The same cut, the same pattern. No podium, no fanfare, just her voice, and the legacy she now carried, not from a battlefield, but from the roadside where the fight for dignity began. She looked out over the sea of young faces, some eager, some nervous, a few distracted, and then she asked calmly, "How many of you think a uniform automatically earns you respect?" A few hands went up, slowly, some halfway. She nodded. "I understand why you believe that. You've been taught that this patch," she touched her sleeve, "means something." She stepped forward. "But I need you to understand the truth, and I'm not going to yell it, I'm going to show you." She recounted it briefly, not as a victim, not with drama, just facts, precision, quiet gravity, a traffic stop, an assumption, a test she passed, a badge that became a weapon, a courtroom, a verdict, and above all a truth, that power, when unchecked, becomes abuse, that silence, when repeated, becomes complicity, and that leadership, when done right, leaves no one unseen. You are going to wear this uniform in rooms that don't understand you, on streets that judge you, in systems that weren't built for everyone the same way. She paused. In those moments, you'll be tempted to perform power, to lean on your title, your weapon, your orders. Don't. Another pause. Lean on your character. A stillness settled over the room. Even the ones who had looked bored were now watching. This uniform isn't a shield, she said. It's a weight, and your job is to carry it with enough integrity that it never crushes anyone else. She glanced around, letting it sink in. Because there will come a day when you're the one holding authority, when no one's watching, no cameras, no rank, just you, and a decision. Her voice lowered, not in volume, but in depth. When that moment comes, remember this. The difference between control and command is character. She stepped back. No applause followed. That wasn't the point. The recruits didn't need a hero, they needed a mirror. And Naomi had held it up for all of them to see. As she exited the auditorium, a young woman, barely 20, rushed to catch up. "Ma'am," she called, breathless. Naomi turned. "I just wanted to say, I think I would have frozen that night if it were me." Naomi nodded. "A lot of people would have. But you didn't." Naomi studied her, then offered a small, quiet answer. "That's what training is for. Not just the kind that teaches you to survive, but the kind that teaches you not to disappear." And with that, she walked out into the sunlight. Not for a headline, not for a medal, but because her work, her real work, was already moving forward in the hearts and minds she had just reached. This story isn't about a courtroom win. It's not about revenge or punishment. It's about what dignity looks like when it's threatened. It's about what leadership sounds like when it whispers, not roars. It's about the quiet resistance that changes systems more than shouting ever could. And most of all, it's about the truth that power without accountability is just theater. But power with character? That's legacy. What Colonel Naomi Bryant did wasn't loud, it wasn't flashy, but it changed everything. She didn't raise her voice, she raised the standard. She didn't fight for revenge, she stood for truth. And in doing so, she reminded us all that real power is never about dominance, it's about dignity. Because leadership isn't proven when the world is watching. It's revealed when you're alone on a quiet road, with no one behind you but your own conscience, and you still choose to do the right thing. So if this story moved you, if it made you think deeper about respect, accountability, or the quiet strength it takes to stand alone, we want to hear from you. Tell us in the comments, have you ever had to stay calm in a moment where someone else tried to silence your worth? Like this video if Naomi's courage inspired you. Subscribe for more stories that remind us, character is louder than any badge, rank, or uniform. And always remember, silence protects the powerful, but courage protects everyone else.